Dr. Wood. Hey!
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you. Tennis shoes at 89, are you kidding?
Good evening, skeptics and believers alike. She just said the question, how do they keep it secret? Everybody knows that in Washington you can't keep secrets and that military intelligence is an oxymoron. But on the other hand, most of us, I think, don't believe everything that the government tells us is true and complete. So today, I'm going to tell you how they keep it secret in 3 parts. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you the nature of the kind of things that I'm suggesting might be kept secret. Actually, I think of these 6 things, probably 5 of them have already been mentioned as possibilities. The Nazis may have landed on the moon in 1942. Admiral Byrd was defeated, of course, in Antarctica. The Nazis flew over Washington, D.C. in their craft. The 1952 sighting in the summer was the Nazis. The 1962 had U.S.-Russia joint landing. And then, of course, I'll tell you a little bit about it, but when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, he not only placed the American flag there, he placed the Masonic flag. And then we may have had multiple alliances for 4 races. Now, I'm not claiming that these are true, because as Richard Dolan just finished saying, you need to have evidence. And so that's why we're having this symposium here, is to just listen to the evidence. But the kind of secrets that I'm claiming may have been kept secret are these kind of secrets. And so I want to tell you how I think people and governments can keep these kind of things secret. And I'm going to do that in 3 parts. First, I'm going to give you my professional background, so I have some credibility. Second, I'm going to tell you the specific techniques that I think are used. And then finally, if there's time at the end, I'll tell you a summary of what I think has been going on in the world since 1940. Now, I began with good advice from my father. He said, if you want to be a better engineer, go get a PhD in physics. So I went to Cornell and did that. But immediately I went to work for a company that I liked, the Douglas Aircraft Company. And one of the first things they put me on to was how to keep the fins of this Nike Zeus missile cool. So that was my first job, and it was a lot of fun. Actually, I hired a guy by the name of Jerry Buss to figure out how much Teflon we should put on. And he later went on to own the Lakers, but that was just an accident. The second thing the company asked me to do is to help 30 or so engineers manage the independent research and development program. And basically, they were required to have oral and written presentations to describe their projects, which would in fact advance the defense of the United States. And for that, we would get indirect costs. And the higher their scores were, the more indirect we got. So it was an important thing to do. And that led, in some cases, to the company getting big contracts. The third thing that I did was they said, you know, we need to have you, you're a physicist, you know everything, so therefore you're going to become a radar expert. And so they put me in charge of managing the General Electric radar, phased array radars, which is shown right here. This is actually one that would be equivalent of what was on Kwajalein Island to detect the incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so I solved that problem, and I'll come back to some aspects of that in a moment. And then finally, they said, well, we want you to take, they came in and they gave every manager a computer and said, okay, we're going to now use advanced technology to see how we can make the space station cheaper, better, sooner, and safer. And actually, NASA decided the safer would be the lead, so they focused on cheaper, sooner, and better. And then finally, as I was kind of retiring, they asked me to help write executive summaries because I'd been kind of doing that thing. And I wrote an executive summary for the Delta program, which turned out to be one of the most successful launch vehicle programs in the country for many years. Well, that was my professional white world background. In the middle of that, I had an incident that occurred that caused me to have a UFO background. And that is when my boss actually had to give a presentation to the Air Force 1 week from that day. And he said, Bob, I'm supposed to tell them how we go to orbit and back 10 years from now. Do you have any ideas of how we do that? So for a joke, I said, well, gee, Ray, why don't we tell them how the alleged UFOs do it? And he said, that's a great idea. Why don't you work on that? And that's when I read my first book on UFOs, Don Menzel. I didn't really much of it. But anyhow, I became very familiar with the subject, joined APRO, joined UFOs, joined NICAP, and then became knowledgeable. And a year later, by accident, my boss, who had asked me this question, had to take a trip. So I was the one responsible for reporting on how our 200 or so engineers were doing in getting new contracts. So I finished this contract report. I mean, it was a good report. But one of the vice presidents said, well, you know, Dr. Wood, we don't see much of you. Tell us what you're doing that's interesting. So after a moment of silence, well, I said, you're not going to believe this, but in the last year, I've read 50 UFO books. And I've concluded that there's no question but what their actual craft, and that they're piloted by somebody inside. And the only thing that's uncertain is to whether we figure out how they work before or after our competitor Lockheed. And so after a moment of silence, one of the guys said, what do you think it would take to look into that? And it turned out that we started a little IRAD project to do that. And in the next year and a half, we spent $1.5 million, which was, you know, kind of an unusual thing at that time. We called the project The Boys in the Back Room. And one of the things we did was read the technical literature. And actually, I hired Stan Friedman because at that time, he was the only guy who claimed to know anything about the subject. And he did. He made a deal with me and the company that his employment would be kept secret. And he honored that deal up until like 15 years ago when the company was sold and nobody cared. But anyway, it was a fun time. We interviewed alleged abductees. We looked at basic physics, tried to figure out whether there were some equations that were missing or wrong. We spun magnets in the lab. We tried to affect the speed of light by putting magnetic fields in an axial direction, and we instrumented the van with equipment and sent it to the top of a mountain to look for UFOs, to get records. Well, at the end of about a year and a half, we knew one thing for sure: how fast we were spending the money. and we decided that we didn't know really how close we were coming to any of these answers. Everything that we did turned out to have no result. All the experiments we did had no anomalies. I mean, even though we were hoping for them, looking for them, we couldn't find them. So then what happened was that this was a nice time because that was the time when there was Snippy the horse and lots of cartoons. I assure you, madam, if any such creatures as you described really existed, we would be the first to know about it. The ones in the Air Force there. So this was a fun time. But in 1970, I was asked to become involved in ballistic missile defense, which I showed you a picture of that. And I did that for a long time. And then at the end of my career, 1993 or so, I had retired, and I got a phone call from Stan Friedman. He said, you know, Bob, he says, good to talk to you again. How are you doing in retirement? I said, well, I'm fine. He said, well, he says, I know you don't have anything to do because you retired, but he said, I've just come across an interesting document, and it says it's called Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology Recovery and Disposal. He said it's a fax, and I don't know whether it's any good or not, but are you interested in looking at it? Well, it turned out that I flew to Washington to talk to the guy who had the document, Don Berliner, and went to a high-quality photographic place and got really good quality 8.5 by 11s of this, the negatives on this document, which basically looked like this. Oh, well, this was the title, Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology Recovery and Disposal. Fundamentally, it explained in about 24 pages what the history was of the MJ-12 program and how you keep the public in the dark about knowing that we are trying to recover crashed saucers and figure out where they work, how they work. But the first question I encountered was it genuine? Because I didn't know. I had these high-quality copies, And I was there in Washington, D.C., so I made an appointment with the public printer. Actually, it turned out it was a guy who had about to retire. And he'd worked there back in the 50s and 60s. And his name was Robert McCarter. So I introduced myself, and I said, well, you know, this is a little unusual, but I have a top secret document that has been given to me. It's not illegal to have one in this country. It is in the United Kingdom, but it's not illegal for me to have that. So I said, I'm trying to figure out whether or not this is authentic document or not. And I wondered if, since it says Government Printing Office on it, could you tell me whether or not, what do you think? So anyway, Robert McCarter looked at it, turned over the 24 pages, and he for about, I'd say at least 5 minutes, he was reading every page. And then he put it down and he said, well, Dr. Wood, he said, based on the content, I would say it's obviously phony. But, he says, based on the fact that I recognize the letters at Monotype Modern because of the curls on the F's and the G's, and because there's a Z occasionally that's raised, I believe it's authentic. Basically, this is a picture of the front cover. It also had a War Office logo on it, and the TO numbers were consistent with the policy. There were a lot of things about it that were consistent with the policy at the time. But this is the image I want you to look at, and in particular, no, you can't see it probably from the back, but this word unauthorized as a Z that's slightly raised there? Yeah. Okay, well, that's the Z he found, and actually there were 2 or 3 others in the document. And he said, well, Dr. Wood, what happened is in those hot lead presses of the time, and that was the kind he said I used to use, there would be on seldom used letters, such as the Z, there would be some debris that would catch. And so when the Z slug came down, it wouldn't seat fully. And so therefore, it would be slightly raised. And that's why he said, I think that's an authentic document. Now it turned out to be just one of many pages of documents. I wound up giving a presentation to a UFO group. In fact, my first presentation to a UFO group was really on this subject. And I think Linda Moulton Howe was in the audience at that time. It was probably like 1999 or 2000. And at that time, there was a lot of enthusiasm of the fact that I brought more than just opinions as to whether the document was authentic. And the word had spread a little bit, and so all of a sudden, I got a call from Stan Friedman again, and he said, you know, I've got a guy who claims he's getting leaked documents. He lives in Big Bear Lake. He said, you know, you live a lot closer to him than I do. Would you be willing to go visit this guy, Tim Cooper, who lives in Big Bear Lake? So I said, sure. And over the next 3-4 years, I visited Tim Cooper, and he gave me the documents that he had received from various sources. Sometimes they were mailed to him. Sometimes one guy just actually came and delivered a whole bunch of documents to him. So I had wound up getting some sort of a reputation of authenticating or trying to authenticate question documents. And so let me tell you this next part of the story. I got a phone call one day from a fellow who I had never heard of. He claimed he was a .com executive. His name was Joe Firmage. And he said he knew Hal Puthoff. Well, I knew Hal Puthoff a little bit then too, because we'd been working together on some remote viewing issues. And so he said, you can check with Hal. He said, I understand you have some question documents that you're authenticating. I said, yes, that's right, Joe. He said, what do you think they're worth? And I said, I don't know. Might be worth millions. So he said, I'm interested in authenticating them. And in fact, if you lend me the documents and they're authentic, he said, I will agree to print some copies for you. He said, I have a yacht in Newport Beach, and you live in Newport Beach. How about this Sunday you come down and show me the documents? Well, I married a woman who thought that I had been wasting my time on UFOs ever since I retired. Fortunately, my present wife doesn't agree with that. And so I said, okay. But anyway, I went down and met with Joe and showed Joe the documents, and Joe said, oh, this is just perfect. This is absolutely the sort of thing I'm looking for. He said, if they're authentic, I get my people to declare they're authentic, you can have 2,000 copies of these and sell them to your own content. So I said, well, Joe, is that it? And he said, were you going to offer anything besides that, like cash? And he said, oh, I forgot. And he opened his briefcase and he took out a check made out to me already for $500,000. So that was a mistake that he'd made. but anyway, we were both satisfied with it, and Joe liked work so much that he asked me and my son and I to make a television documentary on the authentication of documents. So that's kind of my UFO background that established me as some sort of a person to become involved until my son Ryan, whom I mentioned, he got involved in crash retrieval conferences, and I think Richard Dolan just mentioned the importance of crash retrieval conferences. Then in 2009, I met Bill Tompkins. I got a call on the phone, and if you become a little bit known, so people want to call you up and tell you about their sighting. So I was listening and say, well, have you got any documents? And he said, well, yeah, maybe a few. He said, I used to work at Douglas Aircraft. And I said, really? He said, oh, that's where I worked. So anyway, we compared notes, and it turned out we both knew the same people at the same time at Douglas Aircraft. So this guy's credibility went way up in my mind, and we became interested. He said he wanted to publish his autobiography. And I said, well, Bill, you're never going to get rich writing a book on UFOs, but you could try it anyway. So we published this book, and as I became more acquainted with Bill, who's right here in the audience, I learned his real story, and that intrigued me, because if his story is true, it basically establishes the reality of a secret space program, especially one done by the Navy. Okay, with that background now, I want to tell you about how I think governments keep secrets. Now, to begin with, number one, you hide the money. And of course, you do this, we've done this with unacknowledged special access programs, and actually Michael Schratt went through a lot of very, very relevant detail on the processes by which this is done. And many people have also claimed that the USAPs are the way that millions or billions of dollars have been hid. Well, having hidden the money then, you do the second thing is you make it illegal and awkward for anybody to testify that they've been involved in a classified program. In other words, if you accuse somebody of violating their security oath, if they want to argue it, they could go to court. But Truman set up, well, not Truman, but it was in 1978, they set up a court under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that makes it a court that's secret. So you can't ever get your testimony out in public, and the newspapers are not permitted to be involved. So these are the two principal things that begin the process of secrecy. Number one, hide the money, and number two, make it illegal to have open reports. So beyond that, however, there's some standard techniques. And the obvious one is compartmentalization. That is the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, of course, is a classic example. We got the nuclear material at Oak Ridge, and we developed the bomb at Los Alamos. And the people doing one thing didn't know the others. And also, what was it, 130,000 people were cleared to do the secret program, and the whole thing never got leaked. So it is possible to keep secrets by compartmentalization, and that was a good example. Secondly, when you are asked to sign a security oath, it's actually a very specific thing. You're given a piece of paper that says, yeah, I understand that if I violate the security oath, it's going to cost me $50,000 and 15 years in jail. And you sign that with your loyalty, very real. However, before you ever get in that room, you have already been pre-selected. Some people have asked your neighbors what kind of a person this is. They've determined whether or not anybody could be blackmailing you. They want to make sure you have high integrity. So you've already gone through the process of getting selected. And then they ask you to take this loyalty oath. Well then, after that, then there are a number of steps in the process. And let's see, the steps are direct threats, and blackmail, potentially, as you go down this list of things that could happen to you. Now, in my case, I was asked today at the panel, have I ever been threatened? And the answer is no, I haven't. One thing I forgot to mention is that during my time on ballistic missile defense, we became sufficiently good at Douglas Aircraft Company that the CIA, who already had a contract with us, asked us to cover the ballistic missile defense of the Soviet Union. And that was a project for which I was actually first cleared, and then I was asked to run the project because the guy who was running it was retiring. So this was in a SCIF, a Special Compartmented Information Facility, and those are built and designed so that you don't have any toilets inside, so you can't actually tap any faucets or pipes or anything like that. And there are procedures to be used that you give a separate badge, for that when you go in, and you see other people with the same badge, and you get a feeling of camaraderie. You say, "Wow, we are the only people who are cleared for this stuff." So that sense of loyalty expands. So I told you that we do a pre-selection and look for honesty and loyalty. And incidentally, orphans are a plus for this, so you don't have other family members. Now, most people are 100% sincere. They offer you evasive answers. If people want to know, well, what are you doing in that program? You tell them, well, we're studying this or that. And however, what happens is as people approach death, if they feel they've been involved in something that is illegal or unethical, and that more people should know, or the public should know, then they become whistleblowers. No, actually, Bill Tompkins is not a whistleblower because he's never been asked to not say what he's been saying. So whistleblowers typically are people who actually are violating their security oaths. So the direct threats and blackmail, it's a sequence. You have already signed the written agreement for jail time, and then there's a threat to lose your clearance, and then possibly you could get a man in black phone call. In fact, Linda Moulton Howe, for example, as she was interviewing a recent person whose name is anonymous in a book by that name, she was in fact threatened to stop talking to this guy, otherwise bad things were going to happen to her. And of course you can get blackmail and you get a threat to lose your pension. Now that affects a lot of people, especially in the government. And then ultimately, besides threats to loved ones, you could get assassination. Now, I don't have many examples of assassination, but the one that I really like is an example, is this one about James Forrestal. Now, I don't know whether you can read that, but it says, it's somehow distasteful, the use of some kind of measures have been executed, and the untimely death of Secretary Forrestal has been deemed necessary and regrettable. So this came from a CIA document, 1951 or so, where it's a leaked document. Of course, it's not proven to be authentic, but it does state in writing that it's possible that we want to assassinate someone if they get way out of line. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have let you read the ones the words that I was trying to read here. The untimely death of Secretary Forrestal was deemed necessary and regrettable. Now, okay, I'll come back to this at the end and comment on the relationship between this and his actual death. Okay, so those are 4 techniques following the 2 to begin with, which is how do you hide the money and how do you keep people in secret courts. There are another dozen techniques which are called propaganda. During World War II, we used to claim that the Nazis had a propaganda machine. And so the word propaganda was really evil, when we knew as US citizens that they were lying. Well, it turns out that almost all of those techniques that the Nazis had, we are now using too. And the first thing, well, this is a combination of obvious and less obvious ones. The obvious one is you suppress the pilot reports. You make it very awkward, well, you make it illegal for military pilots to report UFOs, and you make it awkward for civilian pilots to do it. Their careers rarely get enhanced by reporting that. You have control daily over the media. And by that, I apply today's mainstream media as a good example. The pilot reports to the media are all prohibited from, but let me mention that control over the media was in one of the classified documents that I have, that the words here are exceptionally impressive. They talked about there was 7 or 8 different things that the government needs to do or know about, and one of them is the government policy of control and denial. And what they say here is one of the most difficult aspects of controlling the perception in the public's mind of government attempts of denial and ignorance is the actual control of the press. And so this is a 1951 document, and they've been trying to control the press completely ever since then. So the question is, do you think they've been successful? Wow. So you have a process in place for controlling the press. There's a little subtlety here that the subject of UFOs, you really have to look up in New Age in the libraries, because the Dewey Decimal System was invented before the idea of UFO, and it's always included in the ghosts or the occult topics, for example. Of course, the obvious thing you want to do is you dedicate the witness testimony. You always begin with how many beers did you have. And the press releases are lies. In fact, in that previous document I showed you with the raised Z, that whole paragraph was on deceptive statements. That is, tell the public this, or that to try to convince them that there was no crash. You have a systematic record of destruction. You obviously have all these records in the National Archives. And if we really want to make sure that the public does not learn, the first place you go is to make sure that the National Archives don't have anything public. So they, no doubt, had a process in place to look for anything to do with UFOs or crash retrievals or anything anomalous and take it out. In fact, once I was in the National Archives personally working with the guy who was assigned to help me, and I had this question document which had a number, a library number, and it should have been on the file. He actually took me back in the stacks and showed it should have been between here and here. And I showed him the document, and then he looked at it and he said, oh, he says, I know the problem. He said, it says flying saucers in the document. That means it's a fake. So that was the final answer that I got from the National Archives, that anything that said flying saucers was a fake. And then, of course, you play up the skeptical views. You actually have the organizations, the skeptical organizations that do everything they can to discredit witnesses. And for example, you know, what the Committee for Scientific Investigation of the Claims of the Paranormal is one that particular, but They're not scientific, they don't investigate, and they lie a lot. And Stan Friedman has written several articles with examples of that. But fundamentally, editors and law enforcement people are much more afraid of being too gullible than they are of being too skeptical. And so therefore they insist on having a couple of witness reports. And while that's true in a sense, if you're trying to prove something, if you're just looking for the truth, in my judgment, you can show by studying the history of science that people who were too skeptical were really the ones who were not right in the long run. That is, the gullible people who said that, well, Einstein might be right, they were the ones who won. And then, of course, there's use of slanted words. We have the word myth, belief, cult, claim, and conspiracy theory. In fact, it has been claimed that the phrase conspiracy theory actually was invented in order to apply to anyone who believed that someone besides Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin for Kennedy. And they have some controlled exposure of data. And one way of doing this is to earmark individual copies so you can identify the leakers. In fact, it's been suggested that sometimes there are different words in some of these classified documents, so that you have some kind of deniability, or you can find out who the leaker is if they're actually leaking this document. Actually, I had a guy, when I was running a small group of thermodynamicists, about 25 people or so, I was trying to do a survey of this group. And so I talked to my administrative assistant and said, let's do a survey and find out what people really think. So I asked them a series of management questions, and they passed out the survey and came back, and I was looking at it and talking with him, and I said, gee, I wonder who said that. And he said, you want to know? And it turned out that he had put in little marks on each of the corners of the pages to identify the individuals. Well, I fired the guy, but that's the process, that it can be used by unethical people to control leaked documents. Now, at one time, it's been claimed, again, that the checkout counter magazines were owned by the CIA, and what they would do is put in some true but totally incredible report in the National Enquirer. And then, of course, when some suggestions came out that this kind of report had happened, then the public would already have been acclaimed to know that that was so wild that it couldn't be true. So this is a good example of psychological warfare. And then occasionally you can have leaks. I don't know whether you can read this, but at one time, CIA employees were controlling some of the stories in the National Enquirer. This says, cat abducted by space aliens, Bigfoot sighted. Who reads this trash? Over 20 million readers. So, and it said, like a leak of fakes to confuse. Now, here's an example coming up that I think is actually not a fake. But it could be claimed to be a fake. It was signed by George W. Bush. And interestingly enough, it was shredded and reconstructed in an old shredding machine that only shredded it one direction instead of both. And it's basically, it's Magic Eyes Only, so it's a majestic program. It's from Rancher, and Rancher, as you know, is the Secret Service code name for Bush. That's up there. And it says, it's basically a change of management for the Majestic 12 program. Bush is saying, you are hereby directed to immediately remove Project Lotus and Starflower from Majestic 12 overview and place same under the authority of the committee. Well, now, presumably the committee might well be the group that's managing the aerospace companies who are building these secret craft. So they take it out of the responsibility of MJ-12, which might well have been a responsible ethical group trying to do the right thing, and put it under the group that was just trying to build craft for cash. In addition, it says Dr. Burish and Severs will continue in their capacity until further notice. Now there's another, this came from Bill Hamilton, who I believe claimed at one time that he was working in Area 51. I think he has some credibility with others in that regard too. There's one other thing about this that intrigued me as I became more familiar with the claims that are almost beyond belief of the today's possible secret space program. And that is that we have interstellar travel, but we may also have some time travel. And so if you look at these words here, it says that the committee will directly oversee all future actions related to the bird and clock issues. Well, now, I would speculate, this is pure Bob Wood speculation, I would speculate that the bird issues are hyperoptic craft and the clock issues are time travel. So that's the kind of way that if you were involved in such a program, you would pick simple words to describe them. But that's probably the best example of pure speculation that you'll hear today. All right, now, I've tried to share with you the specific techniques that I think are used to keep these stories from coming out. And if you consider that each one of these processes really has like say a 99% success rate, and you go through them, 6 of the 99%, you're only going to have half a dozen leakers, perhaps, depending on how many people were exposed. If you have 100,000 people exposed, then you can figure out how many that might be. It might be just a half dozen or so a year. So now, I'm going to briefly kind of wrap up my remarks by summarizing what I've concluded personally about the world history. But part of it is driven by Bill Tompkins. I became involved with UFO crashes when my son started these seminars, and Cape Girardeau, Missouri was the first crash in 1941. And there's some evidence that we took the parts from that crash and did some work on developing the transistor at Purdue University. Then there's the air raid, where the Navy got a craft and the Air Force or the Army got another craft. And my son's book discusses 75 crash retrievals from all over the world. It, together with the other book that was cited, is probably the best references there are. And these are some of the highlights. So World History Revisited, I think, in my mind, it kind of began when I became familiar with Bill. And there he was a few years ago. When he was a kid, he went to Long Beach Harbor, and he made detailed notes, took those notes, and he made these ship models that Michael Sala showed you about last night. And the Forrestal was his... The guy who Bill believes was actually calling the shots, involved not only for the Admiral Rick Obata, but also for this program. I think Bill already showed that he was a popular person with the girls. And the one thing that happened, though, that really excited me is that this is the place that I went to work at for probably 20 years, Douglas Aircraft Company on Santa Monica Boulevard in Santa Monica. And we were there for 13 years together. He worked for Klemperer and Elmer Wheaton. Klemperer was a German scientist who came over in 1935, and he was the one who brought what I think was some of the Nazi data that was more classified but I'm not sure that he knew all. And Elmer Wheaton was a guy who was my boss's boss's boss at one point in time, and was highly regarded as the guy who was going to go to the top instead of a fellow by the name of Charlie Abel. But he didn't. And he suddenly, out of the blue, he left and he went to, guess where? Lockheed. And he took along with him some of the best people. But I knew these people personally, and actually Klemperer was the person who looked at the work that I'd been doing on thermal heating and encouraged me to give a professional paper in Milan, Italy, first time I'd ever been out of the country. Well, Bill, you've seen this one. This is a sketch done by Bill of a 2-kilometer long spacecraft carrier. This is a memo, and the people on the memo, basically I knew more than half of these people by name personally. So Bill's employment there was absolutely credible. But he went to work for TRW. And at TRW, he did a lot of exciting, interesting things that are going to be talked about in his second book when that comes out. But in his first book, he said that when he was at TRW, he was assigned to go to another location where he could actually watch an unedited version of the Neil Armstrong landing. And so during that version, he actually saw the video of Neil coming down with a Freemason plaque, a Freemason apron, and then the American flag and a foot in the ground, one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. And what he saw on the crater was these 6 craft. Now, when I say this is not only what Neil Armstrong saw, this is what Bill Tompkins saw on the video that came down from NASA that was not classified. And there are other people who have reconfirmed this with their words. These are the official Apollo transmission words that have been printed in other books. They're on the far side of the crater edge. They're on the moon watching us. So my new historical perspective, to sort of wrap this up, is what I visualize is this is Bob Wood's most likely opinion of the real story. Now, this is not the level of credibility that I would want to claim that would meet Richard Dolan's requirements, which are very proper. You need to have evidence. You need to have more than just testimony. But you get lots of people with consistent testimony. That's what's called evidence in a courtroom. And you've seen this quote twice already from Ronald Reagan. But the one thing that's different about the one that I have here is that I went to the Ronald Reagan Library and looked and saw this was in his own handwriting, that the typed version was a replication of what he had in his own handwriting. And then, of course, you heard Ben Rich's famous technology statement, we have the technology to take ET home. And then there's Maria Orsic. She was, and I'm not going to go into the whole story here, but allegedly she worked with Winfried Schumann, who was a technical person who helped her get the first craft built in 1924. Allegedly, Hitler had a treaty with the Draco reptilians in the 1930s, but I do not know that this is a Draco reptilian. I don't know what they really look like. Nazis explored Antarctica in 1938, had a treaty with them. Some reptilian craft were donated by the Germans. And here's sketches of the Hannibal 2 flight test in 1942. This is probably the one that was used to go to the moon by the German. And the moon base is on the backside. It's now called Lunar Operations Control, and you just heard Richard talk about some evidence that might support these kind of claims. The other Hannibals got bigger and bigger, and of course the Germans did not win the war because they didn't really let Hitler have access to all of this stuff. They sent it to Antarctica in a process that was controlled not by Hitler. They did tell Hitler he had a secret place to go, but he was never really in charge. Paperclip let in 5,000 Nazis, and they were useful. Schumann, the guy who helped fly the first one with Maria Orsic and the Vril Society, actually he was sent to Wright-Patterson, and I think Michael Sala showed that chart. But what better than have the guy helping you figure out how the crafts we're recovering were designed than to have the guy who helped fly the first one. And Admiral Byrd went to try to capture Antarctica, and he got roundly defeated by laser weapons that were being manned by either the Nazis or the extraterrestrials or both. The Majestic 12 program was started. Truman agreed to leave the Nazis alone when they threatened him with an overflight in the early 50s. Eisenhower signed treaties with both the Greys and the Nazis in 54, 55, and I don't know that that's what the Grey looks like. There were Grey craft at Wright-Patterson that were seen floating, and I think you heard that testimony today earlier also. And then, of course, you heard Gary McKinnon's testimony today. And these are some of the other intermediate steps that I believe are very likely, might have occurred. That Solar Warden has been protecting our solar system from intruders. We have multiple alliances with four races. These are some of the possible craft. These are not my photos. They're from the Jeff Wrench show, I think. But maybe they are. And then, of course, we have the 3 Solar Warden travelers, one of which is Corey Good, and he'll be talking tomorrow. The basic story is he was trained from childhood, signed up for 20 years in 1987, spent 20 years as Solar Warden, transported back to 1987, given age regression injection. He remembers it all, which is unusual because they were told to forget it. And he's one of the good guys. That would be my view. And now, if this is not incredible enough, you know, if this is beyond belief, I got something more for you. There's a new book that's about a year old now called Disclosed. And this talks about time travel processes that we've had implied to be in the TR-3B spacecraft, which is the triangle, to go to other stellar systems and also to travel back in time. So, but I'll tell you what, after I read this book, some people have said that Bob Wood never had a claim that he didn't believe, you know. But anyway, I didn't really believe this, but I will say this is a great read. I mean, it's just tremendous fiction, even if it's true. My sources are Michael Sala, Herbert Dorsey. Dorsey has, you know, I tried to do a little checking. I thought this guy, Herbert Dorsey, really knows a lot about what was going on. I wonder how he knows. So he had an autobiography about his life. And so I read this autobiography of Herbert Dorsey, and I don't want to say anything negative, but the only time on one page that he ever implied that he had access to information of this sort was on one specific page when he's living in New Mexico. I think he met somebody who told him a lot of stuff. Well, anyway, these are my sources. I've concluded that there are multiple alliances and races, that lots of nations are involved. And the big thing is all of this has been kept secret from the public, from most of the public. And that's the thing that just really kind of blew me away as I began in the last 2 or 3 years to realize that this easily could have been the exact case. Now, you want some good news? Good news, okay. The good news is that some of the aliens are helping, not just the Nordics, but there's others that may be helping too. And instead of having a media that promotes fear, greed, lust, and violence, which is what you see normally on TV every day, one that promotes trust, love, peace, and hope, the kind of things that we all hunger for, especially if we go to church. And it's possible that the truth, the complete truth, the whole truth, not the partial truth, partial disclosure, that truth will lead to controlling our country in a real democracy sense and unlimited energy, so we can have a new world where everything is wonderful. And there you have it.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful. Give him another hand. And come here and show your tennis shoes. 89 years old, and you can't keep up with him. Thank you so much. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and a couple things you might want to remember, or if I sound like a broken record, I am. But at the vendor artist